My name is Claire Matthews. I am 31 years old. I am a certified public accountant at a mid-size financial firm in Atlanta, Georgia. My job is to make sure numbers tell the truth. I have been doing it professionally for 6 years and informally for most of my life. When a loan officer named David Reyes slid a manila folder across his desk on a Tuesday morning and asked me to confirm my signature on a $47,000 personal loan application, I did what I always do when something does not add up. I looked at it carefully. I looked at the date. I looked at the amount. I looked at the purpose listed on the application, home renovation expenses, and I looked at the address on file, which was not my address. Then I looked at the signature. It took me 4 seconds. 4 seconds to confirm what I already knew before I opened the folder. That signature was not mine. I have been signing my name the same way since I was 14 years old. The C curls left before it rises. The M in Matthews has an extra press on the second peak because my 6th grade teacher told me my handwriting was sloppy and I overcorrected and never undid the habit. The signature on that loan application had neither of those things. What it had instead was my mother's handwriting attempting to become mine. I had seen her write my whole life. I knew the way she formed her letters. I knew the slight rightward lean she could never fully suppress no matter how carefully she tried to disguise it. I closed the folder. I looked at David Reyes and I thanked him for bringing this to my attention. Then I told him I would need a moment. He nodded and stepped out of his office, and I sat in the chair across from his empty desk. And I did not cry, and I did not panic, and I did not call anyone. I sat very still for exactly 3 minutes, and I thought about every conversation and every phone call and every wired payment and every holiday drive and every moment I had told myself that this time things would be different. Then I took out my phone and I made one call. Before I tell you who I called and what happened after I walked out of that bank, tell me where you are watching from right now. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. Growing up in Decatur, Georgia, numbers were the language I used to make sense of a world that did not always make sense on its own. My mother, Patricia, worked as a receptionist at a dental office on the east side of town. My father left when I was 7, and my brother Marcus was 4, and the primary thing he left behind besides 2 children, and a woman who had not planned on doing this alone, was a lesson I absorbed so early it became part of how I understood the world. When the people who are supposed to stay do not stay, you stop counting on them and start counting everything else. I counted my mother's paychecks against the monthly bills from the time I was old enough to understand what a bill was. I counted the days between grocery trips and the items in the pantry, and the exact number of meals we could stretch from a single chicken. I counted my school supply list against what we could actually afford and quietly crossed off the items that were wants rather than needs before I showed it to my mother, because I had learned that showing her the full list made her face do something I did not want to cause. She worked hard. I want to say that clearly and honestly because it is true, and because the rest of this story could make it easy to forget. Patricia Matthews worked harder than almost anyone I have ever known. She took extra shifts when she could get them. She clipped coupons with a seriousness most people reserve for professional tasks. She made sure Marcus and I were clean and fed and in school every morning, and she did it alone for years without complaint. What she was not good at was money, not the earning of it, the managing of it. Numbers made her anxious in a way I recognized early and never fully understood because to me numbers were neutral. They were just the truth in a form you could verify. To my mother, they were a source of dread, a reminder of how close the edges always were, a language she had never learned to speak comfortably and had given up trying to learn. When I was 12, I started organizing the household bills without being asked. I made a simple spreadsheet on the school computer and printed it out and showed my mother the categories and the amounts and the dates, and I told her this was how we would stop the late fees. She looked at the spreadsheet for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at me and said, "Where did you learn to do this?" I said I just figured it out. She said nothing else, but she let me take over the bill tracking from that day forward, and she never missed a payment again as long as I was managing the calendar. By the time I was 15, I was handling the household budget entirely, not because my mother had asked me to. Because the alternative was watching her spiral into the particular anxiety that hit her every time something came due, and she was not sure if the numbers would work, And I had discovered that my managing it prevented that spiral, and preventing that spiral felt like the most useful thing I could do with the skill I happened to have. Marcus was 2 grades behind me, and the kind of kid who was always fine until suddenly he was not. He got into trouble in middle school, not serious trouble, the kind that comes from having too much energy and not enough supervision, and a mother who was working 2 shifts on the weeks the dental office offered overtime. I covered for him more times than I should have. I told my mother the calls from school were misunderstandings. I talked to his teachers directly and worked out arrangements that kept things off his permanent record. I told myself I was protecting him. The fuller truth was that I was managing the situation, because managing the situation was what I did, and because I had not yet learned that there is a difference between protecting someone and preventing them from experiencing the consequences that might actually teach them something. I graduated second in my class. I got a partial scholarship to Georgia State and covered the rest with loans and a part-time job at a tax preparation office that turned out to be the best professional education I could have received, because it put me in a room with real financial documents and real financial problems from the time I was 18 years old. My mother cried at my graduation. Genuine tears, the kind that come from real pride, and I held on to that because in the years that followed there were moments when I needed to remember that her love was real even when her choices were not. I passed my CPA exam on the first attempt at 23. I accepted a position at Hargrove Financial Partners in Atlanta 6 months later, and I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Midtown, and for the first time in my life, I had a space that was entirely organized around my own needs and my own schedule and my own version of order. I loved it with a quietness that surprised me. Not the dramatic relief of escape, but the steady satisfaction of arriving somewhere I had been building toward for a long time. My mother called every Sunday. Sometimes the calls were just calls, ordinary conversations about her week and mine, and whatever Marcus was doing. Sometimes the calls had a purpose I could identify before she got to it, a particular tone in the first 2 minutes that told me something was coming. The something was always money, not always directly. Sometimes it was a story about a car repair or an unexpected bill or a situation at work that had affected her hours. Sometimes it was about Marcus, who had gotten through high school and 2 years of community college and had not yet found the thing that made him want to keep going and was living at home and contributing to the household expenses in a way that was more theoretical than actual. I sent money when she asked. Not every time, but most times. I told myself I was in a position to help, and helping family was what you did when you were in a position to do it. What I was slower to see was the way the requests had become architectural. They were not occasional emergencies. They were load-bearing structures in a budget that had been quietly rebuilt around the assumption that I would fill whatever gap appeared. I noticed it properly for the first time about 2 years before the bank meeting. I was reviewing my own personal accounts as part of an end-of-year financial check, and I added up every transfer I had sent to my mother over the previous 12 months. The number was $14,300. I sat with that number for a long time, not because I could not afford it. I could, barely if I was careful, but because I had not chosen it consciously. It had accumulated in pieces, 200 here, 500 there, one larger transfer in March when her car needed a transmission repair, another in September when the property tax bill came due and was higher than she had planned for. I had said yes to each individual request without ever looking at the total. The total, laid out in a single number at the end of a year, looked different from any individual request. It looked like a decision I had never actually made. I did not stop sending money after that. I reduced it. I started saying not right now more often than I said yes, and I stopped explaining myself when I said it because I had learned from years of accounting that you do not owe anyone a justification for your own financial boundaries. You simply hold them. My mother noticed. She did not say anything directly, but I could hear it in the tone shifts, the slight edge that entered her voice when I said not right now, the way the Sunday calls got shorter for a few months before returning to their normal length. Marcus noticed too. He called once on a Thursday evening, which he almost never did, and spent 20 minutes telling me about a business idea he had before getting to the part where the business idea required startup capital. He did not have and was wondering if I could help him get started. I told him I could not fund the startup, but I would be happy to review the business plan and help him identify legitimate financing options. He said he would send the plan. He never did. 8 months before the bank meeting, I started getting a feeling I had learned over years of professional work to take seriously. It was not a specific thought. It was a quality of attention, a low-level alertness that came when something in a set of numbers was not quite adding up, but I had not yet identified where. I noticed it first when my mother mentioned offhandedly that she had gotten the back porch repaired. The back porch had needed repairs for years. She had not asked me for money for it. I had not sent any. I filed the information and moved on. 3 weeks later, she mentioned new appliances. A week after that, a comment about having finally sorted out the roof situation that had been worrying her for 2 years. I kept filing. I kept noticing. I did not yet understand what I was noticing. I understood it completely on a Tuesday morning in a bank office when a loan officer named David Reyes slid a folder across his desk and asked me to confirm my signature. I called my attorney from the bank parking lot. Her name is Sandra Ackafer, and she has been my personal attorney since I was 25 years old, which is something most people my age consider unnecessary, and which I consider one of the most important financial decisions I have ever made. I told her what I had found. I described the folder, the amount, the signature, the address on file, the loan purpose. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if I had touched the documents. I said I had handled the folder but had not removed anything. She said good. She told me to go back inside and inform the loan officer that I would be filing a fraud report and that no further action should be taken on the account until the matter was legally reviewed. She said she would have a letter to the bank by end of business. I went back inside. David Reyes was still in his office. He looked up when I came in, and I could tell from his expression that he had already understood, from the way I had left, that this was not a straightforward confirmation appointment. I told him clearly, and without raising my voice, that the signature on the application was not mine, that I had not applied for this loan, that I had not authorized anyone to apply on my behalf, and that my attorney would be in contact with the fraud department before close of business that day. He wrote everything down. He asked if I knew who might have submitted the application. I said I had a strong suspicion and that my attorney would be providing that information through the appropriate channels. Then I thanked him, stood up, and walked out of the bank into the Atlanta morning and drove to my office and sat at my desk and opened my work files and did what I always do when something difficult is happening outside my control. I worked, precisely and completely and without stopping until 5 in the afternoon. That evening, Sandra called to confirm the fraud report had been filed and the loan account had been frozen pending investigation. She told me the bank's fraud team would be contacting me within 48 hours. She also told me, gently but directly, that because the application had included my personal information, including my social security number, this was not simply a matter of a forged signature. It was identity theft, a federal matter. I said I understood. She said, "Do you want to tell me who you think did this?" I told her. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, "I am sorry, Claire." I said, "Thank you, Sandra." Then I hung up and I sat in my apartment in the quiet and I thought about my mother for a long time. Not with anger, not yet. With the particular exhausted clarity that comes when something you have been half knowing for a while finally becomes something you fully know. My phone rang 11 times that evening. I did not answer. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within 5 days, the bank's fraud team had traced the application to an IP address registered to my mother's home internet account. Within 10 days, Sandra had a complete picture of the timeline. The application had been submitted 4 months earlier. The loan had been approved 3 months earlier. The funds, $47,000, had been deposited into an account opened in my name at a different branch of the same bank, an account I had never opened. Using a copy of my identification my mother had photographed without my knowledge during a visit 18 months prior when I had left my wallet on her kitchen counter while I helped her carry groceries inside. The money had been withdrawn in portions over 11 weeks. Home repairs, new appliances, a used car for Marcus. The remainder in cash, withdrawals the fraud team described as consistent with ongoing household expense management. Sandra laid all of this out for me in her office on a Friday afternoon with the particular careful neutrality she uses when delivering information she knows will land hard regardless of how it is framed. When she finished, I sat for a moment. Then I asked her what my options were. She gave them to me in order. I could pursue full criminal charges, which, given the federal identity theft component, carried serious potential consequences, including prison time. I could pursue civil recovery, which would focus on recouping the $47,000 plus legal costs, but would not result in criminal prosecution. I could do both. Or I could, she said carefully, choose to handle it differently, which she did not recommend professionally, but which she understood was something some clients needed to consider when family was involved. I told her I needed the weekend. She said, take it. I drove home and I made tea and I sat at my kitchen table, and I did not call my mother and I did not call Marcus and I did not call anyone. I looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, and I thought about a 12-year-old girl making a spreadsheet on a school computer to keep the lights on. I thought about $14,300 accumulated in invisible pieces over a single year. I thought about a signature that was not mine on a document I had never touched. I thought about the back porch and the new appliances and the roof that had finally been sorted out. And by Sunday evening, I knew exactly what I was going to do. On Monday morning, I called my mother. She picked up on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting. Her voice was careful in a way it had never been with me before, measured and slightly formal, like someone who had rehearsed an opening line and was waiting for the right moment to use it. I did not give her the moment. I told her I knew about the loan. I told her I knew about the account. I told her I knew about the identification photograph and the timeline and the withdrawals. I told her my attorney had a complete picture and that the bank's fraud team had already filed a federal report. She was silent for so long I checked the call to make sure the line was still connected. Then she started to speak, and I said, Mom, I am not calling to have a conversation. I am calling to tell you what is going to happen. She went quiet again. I told her that I had instructed Sandra to pursue full civil recovery of the $47,000 plus legal costs. I told her that whether criminal charges were also pursued would depend entirely on what happened next. I told her that she had 30 days to provide a full written accounting of every dollar spent and to begin a repayment arrangement Sandra would oversee. I told her that Marcus would need to find alternative housing within 60 days because I would not be held financially responsible for a household I had not agreed to support. I told her that all future contact between us would go through Sandra until the civil matter was resolved. She asked if I was really going to do this to my own mother. I said, Mom, you did this. I am just the one who knows what to do with the paperwork. Then I hung up. My hands were steady. My voice had not wavered once. I sat for a moment in the quiet of my own apartment and felt something I had felt once before, in a bank parking lot, in the 3 minutes before I went back inside. Not anger, not triumph, the particular stillness of a person who has finally stopped absorbing something that was never hers to carry. The civil case resolved in 4 months. My mother signed a repayment agreement under Sandra's supervision. It would take her 7 years to repay the full amount given her income, but the agreement was legally binding, and Sandra would monitor compliance quarterly. Marcus found an apartment with 2 roommates within the 60 days. He called me once during that period, not to apologize and not to argue, just to say he had not known about the loan. I believed him. Marcus has always been the person things happen around rather than the person who arranges them. I told him I was glad he had found a place. He said he was going to try to get things together. I said I hoped he did. We have spoken a few times since then, carefully, at a distance that is honest about where we are. My mother and I have not spoken beyond what the legal process required. I do not know if that will change. Some part of me still remembers the woman who cried at my graduation, and I hold on to that not because it changes what happened, but because it keeps me from reducing her to only what she did. What she did was serious. What she did had a name, and that name was identity theft, and it was not a gray area or a misunderstanding or a family matter that could be resolved with a conversation. But she was also a woman who had worked 2 shifts and clipped coupons and made sure 2 children were clean and fed and in school every day, alone, for years. Both of those things are true. I am learning to hold both of them without letting either one erase the other. What I did not do after all of it was fall apart. I went to work. I reviewed my credit report and placed a permanent fraud alert on my social security number. I changed every financial account and every password and every piece of identifying information that could be traced back to anything my mother had ever had access to. I updated my emergency contacts. I reviewed my professional liability coverage. I did what accountants do. I made sure the numbers told the truth, and I made sure the truth was protected. There is a version of this story where I feel guilty, where I wonder if I was too formal, too legal, too willing to let the process run its course without leaving more room for the human parts of it. I visited that version briefly. I gave it less time than it asked for. The truth is that I had been the person who managed the numbers since I was 12 years old. I had been the safety net and the spreadsheet and the backup plan and the one who answered on the first ring for 19 years. And when the person I had been doing all of that for decided that my name and my credit and my financial identity were simply one more resource available to her without asking, she did not make a family mistake. She made a financial crime. And I am a CPA. I know exactly what to do with those. If someone in your life has been treating your resources as their own, your credit as their backup, your name is something they can borrow without permission, you are allowed to file the report. You are allowed to call the attorney. You are allowed to let the process work. You are allowed to hang up when you have said what needed to be said. The accounts are closed now. The fraud alert is active. The repayment plan is running. And I sleep without the low-level alertness that had been waking me for months before I understood what it was trying to tell me. What would you have done with that folder? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reached something in you, you already know what to do.